So now there is a second keynote, and this keynote comes from science. As we are at a conference that deals with experts and the real economy, so to say, and the financial system, but also with the science. So Wissenschaft und Praxis.
Science and Practice is the title of this working group, of the DACHLILU working group, I must say. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome Professor Schulz here with his keynote speech, Green Finance Interrupted. Professor Schulz is a geographer first. He's economic geographer, and he's a professor at the European Sustainability, Spatial Development and Analysis since 2006.
Department of Geography and Spatial Planning at the University of Luxembourg. His research focus are in the fields of environmental economic geography and sustainability transitions. Und hat auch...
And he also studied in Germany, also at the University of the Saarland, and in Cologne, of course, and in the United States. Professor Schulz, the floor is yours, and we're pleased to listen to your presentation.
Vielen Dank, Frau Holz.
Thank you very much. I was told to continue in German. I think it's okay for everybody. Sorry. It has many disadvantages to have this late slot here in this closed room to you, but it has one advantage because many things have been said already, many topics have been mentioned already in the course of the day. So I can concentrate now on aspects which haven't been mentioned yet, or aspects that have been mentioned but that I perhaps see differently, slightly differently, or interpret differently. I will try to do both in a compact way. And before I do that in the form of 4 questions, I would briefly like to give you some context so that you know who is standing before you, who is talking to you now, in addition to the very nice introduction I got. I'm an economic geographer. After Ferron, perhaps I'm the only speaker today who has nothing to do with financial questions more particularly, who doesn't come from the practice of this industry, or has been working for a long time there. As an economic geographer, I've been dealing with transformation processes in a number of sectors, industrial sectors, most recently with the finance sector, part of a project consortium which is called Altfin, dealing with alternative financing modes of local economies, but also dealing with the role of green finance in global value chains, for instance, the electromobility and the battery industry. Hauts-de-France, we're studying north of France, Luxembourg and Saxony. Elena Emmerich-Schmitz asked a question this morning. She's also there. She will be here on the panel tomorrow on alternative or local initiatives and need for financing and financing modes. Other colleagues, unfortunately, cannot be with us here today. I mention this because I'm in this consortium. I'm the only non-financial expert, and still in 2018, together with Sabine Dörri, in this new blossoming green sector in Luxembourg, tried to shed a critical light on this. There comes the title. From there comes the title of my presentation today. This is probably the reason why they invited me on this topic, because we're reported on this topic. I'm not going to refer to this article. I'm not going to refer to our project in detail. What I'm going to tell you now in the coming minutes is general remarks that I share with my colleagues that we collected not only in Luxembourg over the years, and which may shed a different light on what we discussed here today, or also express some criticism. There will be 4 questions I'm going to present to you. These questions might seem very critical, maybe simplistic. I apologize for that. And I emphasize that, of course, that we, of course, recognize what has been achieved in recent years in this sector. We've heard lots of these things today, the dynamics on the regulatory side, on methodology, standards, etc. and what great strides forward have been achieved. But nevertheless, there's still some open questions that we need to ask and that I want to discuss with you here today. Question number one sounds very general, and I'm not going to deal with it so generally. What is sustainable? How can sustainability be defined? There's just two additional aspects I want to add to what we heard about indicators today, criteria, standards, and what we heard about impact. My perception of many of the debates and also some of the discussions here today is that we are dealing with a very short-sighted understanding of impact when we deal with impact at all. There was mention of double materiality earlier on, impact on the financial system, the risks that everybody's concentrating on today, and the impact of the financial industry on the environment or on social matters, the other side of the coin. And very little was said about that today, or only indirectly. I was very surprised. But even this second dimension, looking at the impact of what we're doing because of our investments, is a bit too short-sighted in the way we look at indicators and looking at the system and how we use indicators. It's very superficial. We know quite little. If you look at the complexity of sustainability, we know quite little about the positive or negative feedback loops we might generate in the long term, both ecologically and in social matters. Few of the monitoring systems that we have today, that we use today, are long-term monitoring system and cannot observe over longer periods of time and in more detail what actually happens after certain investments in certain regions of the world, in particular places and in particular industries. Which means we have a very short-term, superficial glimpse at specific politically defined indicators, CO2 emissions, for instance, as mentioned several times today, but we don't know much more of what is behind all that, and if possibly there might be counterproductive impacts possibly resulting from that. My second question is, and I call it granularity. We talked about investments this morning, that the investment volumes are there that are needed to achieve the Paris objectives. They just need to be redirected, and this redirection is underway, as you know, and this redirection meant that big institutional investors, pension funds and others, very quickly moved a lot of capital, took a lot of capital in hand. I'm sorry, I'm not speaking your jargon. I don't know all the nice acronyms that we heard today, but I'm saying this in plain language. Large volumes of capital, which relatively at relatively short term. That's what I call shortism. So, in very short time, they are redirected in other, or need to be invested in other industries or sectors. Let me take the example of the big reforestation projects in Vietnam or Malaysia or any other country of the global south, which on the impact side are framed as extremely sustainable and certified, but which possibly ignore local context. Small farming structures can be destroyed, traditional ways of life, and perhaps in the long term are questionable in ecological terms. All this is not covered by the indicator systems that we talked about today, as far as I know, or only in a very superficial way. So the question whether this pressure to act, which is also caused by the fact that more and more investors, institutional and private investors, are looking for green products, does this pressure to act, does it match the offer of investment possibilities? Are there really so many projects that can be called sustainable to absorb these financial volumes? Another open question that I would like to discuss with you. My question number three is, who needs sustainable financing or finance? It was mentioned very briefly in one of the previous presentations that for small and medium-sized companies, this is not covered, has hardly been covered in this big dynamics that we're talking about here today. Here again, question of granularity. Who needs what type of support? Are there any actors who have no access to classical banking financing, or who perhaps refuse financing by banks because they don't want to get involved in this loop of interest, repayment dynamics, this obligation to grow, but want to finance themselves independently, locally, crowdfunding, etc. All these other types of sustainable financing, which might not be mentioned in mainstream debates because of their marginal size, or hardly any ever mentioned. And my fourth question is, was not mentioned here today, that this big dynamics, this greening of a whole industry, which has been very reticent as compared to other sectors, that this catching up creates a great vacuum, or shows a big lack of skills and specific knowledge and professional profiles. And legal experts, economists who are great experts in their field, whether it's in investment banking or in regulation, etc., suddenly need to become sustainability experts, or are supposed to become sustainability experts, because the market is changing. So this need for trained people who do not exist or did not exist, or only here and there, created a new industry, if my observation is correct, of various formats of further training measures, additional university degrees, which are supposed to qualify people formally as a sustainability advisor, the lead sustainability investment advisor, etc. There are very nice titles, formal qualification, which are not protected, still not protected in an extreme case. These extreme cases exist also in Luxembourg, in big advisory companies, and they can get this qualification after 3 hours. So a legal expert, an economist, after 3 hours of training, can be called a certified advisor for ESG or advisor for climate finance, and also call himself that title with customers. So the question is whether these are actually the best advisors. I don't want to mention Mariana Mazzucato in detail, but that debate exists. And what we observe here in the green finance sector is perhaps typical for a market to create itself as a self-reference. The sector defines their standards themselves and the instruments themselves. The sector trains themselves and certifies itself as qualified in a sector which, as colleagues in Japan, Ken Schumacher, slide is not coming up, so there we go, under the title skill washing or competence greenwashing. That was how it was called. He showed, I cannot really show you all the details, but for the 3 ESG areas, the required qualifications, the training level, seniority, and the professionality. On the left-hand side, you see engineers and scientific qualifications and profiles, and you see that the dark blue are the most appropriate and the light blue the less appropriate. And you see that people only have one further training, or those who, as a rule, work in advisory companies and are in charge of ESG, do not have the right profiles. Far from that. This is not a criticism about these persons. It's a systemic problem, which, as I see it, as we see it, is not being talked about openly, and try to be covered by giving people these well-sounding titles. Let me conclude with 4 short conclusions. The first one is what I said at the beginning when we talked about sustainability and the whole system. I have the feeling that large parts of the mainstream debate deal with the risks for the finance industry much more, and are dealing with the technical question of diligence. So the compliance question: how can we fulfill minimum standards? How can we protect our sector? How can we make our sector sustainable, viable, competitive? But we're not talking about content, the type of sustainability, the level of sustainability that we want to achieve by what we are doing. It's a bit exaggerated. This is an attack on those who do much more. I'm talking about the mainstream debate, not here in this room, but among actors of the financial markets. I would wish, my second point, that the sector, that the industry, in these dynamics, in these many debates, in the many conferences being organized that we've heard about here today, that the industry admits that there is a complexity problem and that they shouldn't do as if this complexity problem can be solved by simple tools, simple indicators, linear measurements of questionable indicators. But that they admit that it's not so easy and that perhaps there might be other tools than the established tools. Other tools are needed for the sector. Connected to that is the critical question, what areas of the financial industry which of these parts can be sustainable at all? What some authors call the financialized finance, so the part of the financial industry which is predominant today and is decoupled from the real economy. So the financial industry, speculation, speculative investments, derivatives, other products on the financial markets, multiplying money without any connection to the real economy. Can that part of the financial sector actually become sustainable? Think of blockchain technology, fintech, which also use a lot of energy and resources. So a fundamental question, fundamental challenge to the financial sector and what they do and in what parts this financial sector can actually become sustainably at all and can make a contribution to sustainability. And finally, one last remark. It sounds a bit black and white. Green finance, sustainable finance is not only a business opportunity, not only an opportunity to open up new markets, adjust yourselves, and be viable in the long term as a sector, but first and foremost, this is a moral obligation, a task for society as a financial sector, which others call the ethic infrastructures, which would make it possible to facilitate societal change to something more sustainable. At the service of this moral obligation, and green finance should not simply be seen as a short-term business opportunity. Thank you very much. Professor Schulz, that was a very impressive and interesting presentation, which puts the whole thing into a quite different light than what we have heard here all day long. Thank you very much for that.